Hello and welcome to the 7th lecture video in the Sheridan College online degree breadth elective course, Introduction to Medieval History. In today's lecture video, we will begin a new millennia as we pass the year 1000 CE and enter into the High Middle Ages. Over the next 3 videos, we'll explore the first 3 centuries of the last millennia. We'll see the flowering of medieval culture in both the Christian and Islamic worlds. We'll watch the medieval economy expand and the resurgence of cities. We'll see the emergence of the great monastic empire of Cluny. We'll also see the growing power of the papacy, the slow decline of the Byzantine Empire, and the rise of new outside powers in the Islamic world from the Saharan desert and the grasslands of Central Asia. In today's video, we'll explore the changed world of the 11th and 12th centuries. All that today on Introduction to Medieval History. The learning objectives for this lesson are: Number 1, understand the decline of the Byzantine Empire in the High Middle Ages. Number 2, describe the political changes to the Islamic world in the 11th century, including the rise of the Seljuk Turks and the Almoravids. Number 3, understand the changes to Western Christianity, including the rise of Cluny, the Gregorian reforms, and the Investiture Controversy. The Byzantine Empire represented the last remnants of the old Roman Empire, a reminder of the ancient past. The part of Rome that had continued while the West fell away. Throughout the early Middle Ages, the great capital city of Constantinople had endured. While historians call them the Byzantines, they continued to call themselves the Romans up until the end, even as the actual city of Rome had long since laid outside the empire for centuries. Over this course, we've seen the Byzantine Empire rise and fall and rise again. At the end of the early Middle Ages, we saw the Byzantine Empire reach new heights under the leader of Emperor Basil II. Over the next few videos, we'll see the slow unraveling of the Byzantines, from which they will not recover. Indeed, the ultimate decline of the Byzantine Empire would be the story of the High and Late Middle Ages, and its ultimate destruction in 1453 would signal the end of an age. In the early 11th century, however, the Byzantines were still strong under Basil. New powers, however, would challenge that. By the High Middle Ages, it had become increasingly clear that the Byzantines were having trouble defending their territory. Their armies were largely composed of mercenaries. Like Western Europe, the empire had increasingly become decentralized, with the emperor forced to cede much territory to warrior lords who essentially ruled autonomous regions within the empire. Moreover, the empire was forced to compromise with outside forces. When the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX was unable to prevent the Pechenegs, a semi-nomadic Turkic people from Central Asia, from coming into the empire, he instead attempted to Christianize them and offered them land in depopulated regions. To the west of the Byzantines, the Normans conquered and established a new kingdom consisting of southern Italy and Sicily. As we saw in our last video, the Normans, originally Norse raiders from Scandinavia, had established themselves in northwest Francia in the early 10th century, giving the land their name, Normandy, for Norsemen. In the 11th century, the Normans expanded much further. In 1066, William the Conqueror captured England and established himself as king. Other Norman leaders pushed south into the Mediterranean Sea. The Norman king Roger II in the 12th century would pose a major threat to the Byzantines from his base in the Kingdom of Sicily. To the east and to the south, the Islamic world of the 11th century was fragmented. The old unity of the Abbasid and Umayyad caliphates had been replaced by competing regional powers such as the Fatimids in North Africa and the Buyids in Persia. Islam itself was divided into 2 different versions, the Sunni and Shia branches. While the Sunni branch had dominated in the early years of Islam, the rise of the Fatimids had seen the ascendance of the Shia branch of Islam. However, the Islamic world would be transformed once again in the 11th century with the rise of new outside powers. The Seljuk Turks were a nomadic warrior people from the Kazakh, the extensive grasslands of what is now known as Kazakhstan. Outside the Islamic caliphates, they were initially hired by Islamic leaders as mercenaries. Over time, they too adopted Islam as their religion, but specifically the Sunni branch. In the mid-11th century, they began a series of conquests of their own, which would see them take over much of the eastern parts of the Islamic world and greatly encroach on the Byzantine territory in Anatolia. In 1040 CE, they defeated the army of the Ghaznavids at the Battle of Dandakhan. They eventually formed two states, the Great Seljuk Sultanate, which would encompass much of modern-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iraq, and Iran. In the west, their victories against the Byzantines would establish the Sultanate of Rum, named for the territories of the Romans, which they'd seized from the Byzantine Empire. Under the Seljuks, the Sunni faith reasserted itself as the dominant branch of Islam. For the next nearly 1,000 years, the Middle East would be dominated by peoples of the steppe. While the Seljuks were the first steppe people to arrive, they would not be the last. In particular, in a future lecture video, we'll see the rise of the Ottomans, who would conquer the last of the Byzantine Empire. However, for a time, the Byzantines continued to endure, although smaller and smaller as the centuries went on. In the far west of the Islamic world, another outside group would expand and challenge the existing powers. The Berber Sanhaja were originally tribespeople from the region of the Sahara Desert. They herded animals and moved with their tents from one water source to another. From their contact with Muslim traders, they adopted Islam, and like the Seljuk Turks, eventually became strict adherents to the Sunni branch of the religion. They were sometimes referred to as the Amula-Thamun, the veiled ones, for both the men and the women wore a veil over the lower part of their faces. Over time, these peoples amalgamated into a federation known as the Murabitun, but they are known today by the Spanish version of their name, the Almoravids, from Al-Murabitun. The Almoravid dynasty would expand northward, conquering the largely Shia Islamic areas along the Mediterranean. In 1070 CE, they founded the great city of Marrakesh in what is now modern-day Morocco. Marrakesh would become their capital, and the Almoravid Empire would eventually cover nearly 2,000 miles from today's Ghana to southern Spain. Their wealth and power made them the center of a trading empire, most famous for their Almerian silk, a luxury fabric which became highly praised throughout the medieval world. In 1086 CE, the Islamic leaders of Al-Andalus, the Muslim Caliphate, which for centuries had existed on the Iberian Peninsula, asked the Almoravid Sultan Yusuf ibn Tashfin for help. In the north, the Christian kingdom of Castile was pushing south into their territory. The Almoravids responded and helped to unite and organize the defense of Al-Andalus. It would ultimately bring the Iberian Peninsula under their control. While the Almoravids would halt the Christian advance for a time, the battle to control the Iberian Peninsula was just beginning. By the High Middle Ages, Christian Europe had grown powerful. Europe had emerged from the chaos of the Viking invasions and the civil wars which had marked the end of the Carolingian Empire in the early Middle Ages, more powerful and confident than ever before. And ultimately, the High Middle Ages would set the Islamic and Christian worlds on a collision course, which would only be resolved through centuries of warfare, the legacy of which we are still living with today. Western Europe at the beginning of the High Middle Ages was a civilization in the midst of massive changes. From the chaotic civil wars of the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire, a sort of temporary feudal peace was felt across much of the continent. In many ways, the year 1000 marked a turning point for Western Europe. It begins with agriculture. Increasing economic competition between feudal lords incentivized maximizing agricultural production. Across Western Europe, we see people draining marshes, clearing forests, and putting new land into cultivation. The introduction of the horse-drawn heavy plow may have also greatly increased agricultural productivity. In addition to all of this, there may have also been the possibility that the climate itself may have changed. During what is sometimes referred to as the medieval warm period, from roughly the year 1000 to 1300, parts of Europe may have experienced slightly warmer temperatures and wetter summers, conditions which would have been ideal to farming. While the exact nature of this climatic anomaly is not entirely understood, recent evidence seems to suggest that it was a mostly regional event, affecting only parts of the northern hemisphere, but it may have been felt particularly in northwest Europe. So perhaps for all of these reasons, Western Europe began to change after the year 1000 CE. The greater agricultural productivity meant more food, and more food meant more people. The population of Europe began to grow. While the exact numbers are difficult to determine, the increase in population seems to have been felt across the continent. In England, where records from the Domesday Book suggest a population of around 1.4 to 2 million people in 1086, the population nearly doubled to as many as 4 or even 5 million people in the year 1300. Evidence suggests similar increases throughout Europe, and as the population increased, so too did trade. Cities, long dormant since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, began to grow once again. In Paris, the population may have reached nearly 280,000 people by 1328. The commercial trade routes of Europe flourished once again. Cities along key water routes connected into a wide-ranging trade network. Along the coasts of Italy, France, Spain, and the English Channel, port cities bustled with activities. River systems such as the Rhine, the Rhone, the Po, the Meuse all carried this trade far inland. Old Roman roads found themselves in use once again, as well as new roads, which cut through the countryside, linking urban centers across Europe. As the cities grow, we begin to see larger numbers of people who don't fit into this simple old tripartite society which defined the early Middle Ages: those that work, those that pray, and those that fight. In the cities, a new merchant class grows in size and power. The noble lords who once controlled these cities, in competition with one another for inhabitants and trade, are forced to concede charters which grant these cities more and more freedom. Different trades begin to band together to protect their interests and to ensure standards. Clothmakers, fishmongers, carpenters, and masons, the first medieval guilds. Eventually, the guild system would become the default organizational power structure in cities. This new class of merchants, craftsmen, and townsfolk would ultimately transform Western society and eventually give birth to the modern age. They were called the burghers, from the medieval Latin word for castle or town, burgus. In French, they were the bourgeoisie, the beginning of a middle class. While it would still be centuries until the middle class would rise up and destroy the old feudal class system, the seeds for the future were already being laid in the 11th and 12th centuries. These developments were part of the so-called 12th century Renaissance, a rapid societal and economic transformation of Europe, which marked the High Middle Ages as a complete departure from the past. However, the economic and social changes were only half of the 12th century Renaissance. In the second video of this High Middle Ages series, we'll be exploring the cultural and intellectual aspects of the 12th century, which includes the rise of new schools and universities, new forms of intellectual thought and art, and massive advances in architecture epitomized by the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. However, in order to understand these intellectual and cultural changes, we must first examine the changes to the Christian church in Europe. For it is ultimately the church that is the driving force behind the cultural and intellectual developments of the 12th century Renaissance. The first 1,000 years of Christianity had seen the religion firmly established across Europe. The Christian church of the year 1000 was largely decentralized. While the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople exerted some power and influence, their reach was very limited and really didn't extend much further than their home cities. Often, real power in the church was in the hands of local rulers, such as kings or emperors, who considered themselves spiritual leaders in their own right and exerted control over the churches in their domain. Priests and bishops were usually appointed by local rulers with little to no involvement by church authorities. Sometimes the positions of priests or bishops, which could be lucrative and powerful positions, were even sold to the highest bidder, a practice known as simony, a way for a king or emperor to reward a follower or to ensure a younger son enjoyed a suitable career. And although many church authorities spoke out against the practice, it was not uncommon for priests, and sometimes even bishops, to marry. However, in the 11th and 12th centuries, calls for reform of the church grew louder. A reform movement sparked by a wave of religious enthusiasm would sweep across Europe and transform the Christian faith. The beginnings of the reform movement were found in France. In 910 CE, the Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine founded the monastery of Cluny, and they endowed it with money and lands. Now this, in and of itself, was not unusual. Indeed, nearly all monasteries got their start with the generous donation from a noble family. A monastery could be a source of prestige for noble families, a feather in their cap, so to speak, which demonstrated a family's power and influence for all to see. A monastery also provided spiritual support, and monastic foundations were usually included a provision that monks and nuns would pray for the souls of their benevolent founders. Even after a monastery was created, the founding noble families usually continued to exert power and influence over it, such as installing a family member as the abbess or abbot in charge. However, when the Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine founded Cluny, they did something very unusual. In addition to the lands they gave it, they endowed it with freedom. In the founding document of Cluny, the Duke of Aquitaine wrote, "From this day the monks there congregated shall be subject neither to our yoke, nor that of our relatives, nor that to the sway of any earthly power. And though God and all his saints, and by the awful day of judgment, I warn and abjure that no one of the secular princes, no count, no bishop whatsoever, not even the Pope, shall invade the property of these servants of God." The monastery of Cluny would be independent. Over time, it would grow into the first monastic order, the Cluniac monks, spawning a network of monasteries across Europe controlled at its head by the abbot of Cluny. It would become the most famous Christian monastery in the Western world, attracting further donations and land over the centuries. Growing in wealth and power, Cluny offered the guarantee of salvation for all Christians who supported them. The Cluniac monastic empire would also become a powerful force for the reform of the Christian church. In the reform movement, they also found themselves frequently allied with the papacy. During the 11th and 12th centuries, a series of reforming popes transformed the role of the papacy in Europe, consolidating their power and attempting to exert more and more influence and direction over religious matters throughout the continent. Under Pope Leo IX, the papacy increasingly fashioned itself as a monarchy of sorts. Leo, like the abbots of Cluny, believed strongly in the reform of the Christian church, particularly with respect to clerical marriage and simony, that is, the buying and selling of church offices. And indeed, Leo issued several decrees forbidding both of these practices. However, one of the best examples of Leo's steps to establish the Pope as a powerful leader was in his dealings with the Byzantine Empire. The two halves of the Christian church, headed by their respective leaders, the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople, had been drifting slowly apart for centuries. Yet the fiction that there was just one Christian church had continued. The tensions between the two sides reached the boiling point in 1054 CE. when Pope Leo IX sent envoys to the Byzantine emperor at his court in Constantinople. The envoys gave the emperor an ultimatum: acknowledge the supremacy of the Pope as leader of the whole church or face eternal damnation. When the emperor refused, the Pope excommunicated him and the Patriarch. Shortly thereafter, the Patriarch excommunicated the Pope and the Western Church as a whole. The Great Schism, as it officially became known, split the Christian Church into two halves. The East would evolve into the modern Eastern Orthodox Church, and the West would eventually be known as Roman Catholic. While Leo IX had effectively dealt with his chief religious rival, the Patriarch, his consolidation of power in the West was still very limited. Indeed, Leo owed his very position as Pope to the generosity of his cousin, the King Emperor of the Eastern Frankish Germanic Empire, Henry III. The Germanic Empire was the last vestige of the Carolingian Empire, once ruled by Charlemagne. In the centuries since the breakup of the Carolingian Empire, the eastern side, which includes modern-day Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and northern Italy, had continued to call itself an empire, at least during the times it had an emperor. However, it was an empire made up of kingdoms, which together sometimes elected one of those kings to be an emperor, a role that eventually became mostly hereditary as well. During the Middle Ages, this collection of mostly Germanic-speaking kingdoms would arguably be one of the most powerful political entities in Europe. Called variously simply the Empire or Germanic Empire, or in continuance of the days of Charlemagne to the confusion of modern students, the Roman Empire, and after the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire. The Germanic King Emperor Henry III, leader of this empire in the 11th century, had been a champion of church reform, at least in matters of clerical celibacy and the buying and selling of church offices, both of which he was in agreement with the Pope should be stamped out. However, he would never concede that the power of the Pope was greater than his own. Indeed, Henry, like his forebears, considered himself a religious leader as much as a political one. As arguably the most powerful secular leader in Europe, Henry considered it part of his duty to even appoint new popes, as he had done with his cousin Leo. However, a future pope would make it his life's mission to change all of this. A man whose name itself would become synonymous with the reform of the Christian Church, Gregory VII. Gregory was born as Hildebrand of Sovana in 1015 CE in central Italy from a modest family. As a youth, Hildebrand grew up in the Christian Church and, according to several sources, likely became a monk at some point and later a legate and administrator for the Pope. Some chroniclers even suggest that he lived for a time at the monastery of Cluny. When he became Pope in 1073, Hildebrand took the name of Gregory. Under his leadership, the papacy would be completely transformed. The Gregorian reforms, as they came to be known, would set the stage for direct conflict with the German emperors, for Gregory was a believer in papal supremacy. As a successor of the Apostle Peter in Rome, Gregory believed that in matters of the church and religious doctrine, the Pope reigned supreme. In his view, kings and emperors were simply laymen. They had no right to meddle in church affairs. They had no right to make decisions on religious matters, and they especially had no right to have any say in church appointments. When a new priest or bishop took office, they were given the symbolic vestments and physical symbols of office in a ceremony of investiture. They received the lands, buildings, and worldly possessions of the position. A bishopric of a large diocese was a wealthy and powerful position, something which was in the interests of any king or emperor to control. While the papacy of Gregory VII began to claim that this was their exclusive right, on the opposite side, the German emperor and king, Henry IV, had the weight of customs that had evolved over hundreds of years, which placed kings and emperors in positions of religious authority. Indeed, an emperor or king was said to be anointed by God upon accession to the throne. So just as his father Henry III had appointed popes and bishops, Henry IV reserved that right for himself too. The power struggle between Gregory and Henry would come to a head over the appointment of a new archbishop in the city of Milan. The position had remained vacant for several years as two rival candidates, one supported by the Pope and one by the Emperor, vied for control. However, in 1075, fed up with the delays, Henry invested his preferred candidate into the position. Pope Gregory immediately denounced the move, and in a letter to the emperor, threatened that he could be deprived of his position as emperor. Henry responded in turn by calling on the Pope to resign immediately. Using his power and influence, he also had all of the German bishops call for Gregory to resign too. They called Gregory the false monk. 2 months later, Gregory called a synod where he excommunicated Henry and suspended him from office. But Gregory went further. In his decree, there was essentially a declaration of war. He released all Christian men from any allegiance they had sworn to Henry. This war of words was the first volley in what historians call the Investiture Conflict, a power struggle between Pope and Emperor, which would shape the relationship between church and state forever. No pope had gone as far as Gregory to stand up to a king and an emperor. Henry was furious, but his position as emperor was weaker than it would seem. Word of the excommunication of Henry rippled across the continent and added fuel to a groundswell of discontent. Only a few years earlier, Henry had just managed to put down a revolt of the Saxons to his rule. Now, sensing his weakness, nearly all Germanic princes of the empire met to decide what to do. If they rebelled, Henry could stand to lose everything. His position was increasingly precarious. A pope had stood up to an emperor and created a standoff which put the peace of the continent of Europe at risk. In desperation, Emperor Henry traveled to the city of Canossa, where the Pope was staying. According to contemporary sources, while a blizzard raged, for 3 days and 3 nights, the Emperor stood barefoot outside the gates of the castle where the Pope was staying. After this dramatic show of penance, the Pope finally relented and decided to lift the excommunication from Henry. It was a dramatic and humiliating moment for the man who had been the leader of the most powerful Western Christian state. However, despite Henry's dramatic penance before the Pope, his troubles were not over. The Germanic princes of the realm continued their rebellion, and a bloody civil war in the empire raged for several years. In the years to come, Henry would go back on his word and resume his conflict with the Pope. And the heart of the conflict, where the power to appoint bishops resided in a king, an emperor, or a pope, was not resolved. Several decades later, a compromise of sorts was reached under a different pope and a different emperor at the Concordat of Worms in 1122. A distinction was made between a bishop's role as a landowner and a vassal, and his role as a religious leader. In his capacity as a vassal, he would pledge allegiance to the king or the emperor. However, in his role as a spiritual leader, he would be elected by the church. While neither side of the Investiture Controversy would achieve complete victory, the conflict would have profound consequences to medieval history that can be felt even to this day. In the years following Henry IV's submission to Gregory VII, future popes will become more powerful and influential than ever before. Indeed, it would be a pope, Urban II, whose fiery speech on November 27, 1095, will launch the First Crusade, which will pit the Islamic world and Christian one into a conflict which will span centuries. More importantly, however, the investiture conflict would represent the first real steps towards the separation of church and state, a value which will come to define liberal democracy and Western civilization. In our next lecture video, we will see the Islamic and Christian worlds go to war in a scale never seen before. We'll witness the First Crusade and the Second Crusades. We'll see how the victory of the Christians in the First Crusade leads to the emergence of the Christian Crusader states and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. We'll also see the Islamic world regroup and fight back, uniting under the great leader Saladin and the failure of the Second Crusade. In the coming weeks, we'll also explore the emergence of the first universities, the spread of the religious Christian monastic orders such as the White Monk Cistercians, and the beginnings of parliamentary democracy with the Magna Carta. All that to come on Introduction to Medieval History.